I'm not gonna lie, I have hated doing this series. I'm telling you. Every time I post something, I'm just like, ooh, do I need to pull this back up and look at it? So, hey, if you don't mind, I'm gonna take a selfie real quick. I'm just kidding. Sorry. No, hey, my name's Chris. I'm one of the pastors here at Journey Point, and I'm actually loving this series because when you study for something, when you look at it, and it starts to really get ingrained in you, that's where the work is anyways. And so the more I study this, the more I realize I need to study this. And so it's been really, really fun to walk through this. My name's Chris. I'm glad you're here. I can't wait to continue to talk about this today and this aspect. But before I do, one of the things that I'm super fascinated about is just culture in general. I love studying culture and people. And if you really start to study people, if you just look at the human psyche, we're really fascinating people. And it's just unique when you start to study different personality characteristics and traits and all these things that make us and what we're comprised of. It's fascinating to draw into it. One of my favorite things to do is study generations and look at the impact generations have upon one another, but also future generations. And so I'd love to just walk through some generations. How about the silent generation? Silent generation was born from 1945 and before. They're shaped by the Depression. They're shaped by hard times like that. They're very hardworking and very loyal type of people. You have the baby boomers. Baby boomers were born between 1946 and 1964. This is post-World War II. This is post-Vietnam. These really championed the environmental movement that we have today began by this baby boomer. We have Gen Xers. Gen Xers were born, probably have some Gen Xers in here, born from 1965 to 1977. This is kind of post-Cold War, beginning of like personal computers and all of those things. And honestly, Gen Xers struggle a little bit because they're between two really large, impactful generations, being the millennials and the baby boomers. And so they kind of feel like they're lost in between there. Then you have the Zennials. You may not know about the Zennials. It's a pocket that they're actually pulling out from Gen Xers and millennials. I think this is the greatest generation known to man, mainly because I'm a Zennial. And I think it's the greatest generation known to man. I mean, like, we're going to look back in history and say, because of the Zennials, this world is where it is today. Maybe take that for what it is. No, here's the struggle. We don't have an identity, right? So we're not an Xer because we had technology growing up, but we're also not a millennial where like our whole life is infused with technology. So really, Zennials are kind of messed up. So if you know a Zennial or you're born between 78 and 82, join me. So we're there. No, but then you have the millennials. They're born from 1983 to 1996. I love the millennials. My wife is one. So a great generation as well, too. Explosion of the internet, explosion of social media, post 9/11, post these types of things. Not 9/11, but really in the midst of where they can understand it, they're post 9/11. So then you also have Gen Z or iGen, or the generation where we don't really know what to call it yet because it's so new, right? This is 1997 and after is when they were born. And really, they're being raised in a technological world that they don't know what to do because their parents weren't fully ingrained like they were. And so we'll see, only time will tell what the iGen or the Gen Z generation will have. And I just want to pause. Millennials. So any millennials in the room, I just want you to know I love you. Because here's the thing, millennials are getting the raw end of the deal all the time. I mean, they're getting bashed everywhere. They're getting blamed for everything that's going on in our generation. Well, the millennials, all the millennials, it's their fault. I mean, millennials didn't raise themselves, by the way, so it's like, hold on, we can't take all the blame and put it on them. I mean, they're saying things like they're tied to their phones. They're saying things like they're not hardworking. They're in the everybody gets a trophy generation, so they have all this entitlement and everything else. I mean, millennials are getting a hard time, and I just want you to know, you're the most informed and knowledgeable generation in the history of man. You have these little things that you can have information at your fingertips right away. And so you're a very smart generation. But also, I vastly disagree with some of the other things about them in terms of being tied to their phones and everything else. Because here's the deal. We have a picture of millennials right now that usually ride the train. This is what people think about when they think of millennials. You get on the train and that's all you see. Well, maybe, but back in the day, there were also some other things that people were tied to, right? How about this picture? Where you see nothing but newspapers. So millennials are like, well, you're always tied to these phone things. Well, yeah, isn't that better than being tied to a paper? I mean, it's not that bad, right? They will say things like millennials are just not really in tune with what's going on around the world. They're just all caught up in themselves. Well, that's not true either. Actually, Millennials probably have it a little bit harder because they can find out what's going on around the world immediately. They're very in tune with what's going on. They've been raised on these things where they have access to everything that is going on. You tell me an Xer or a boomer that was raised with these things where you could not just make yourself out to be somebody else because you didn't have these things around you all the time. Literally, whatever you put out there is what people could believe because there wasn't hard proof or document. You name a celebrity right now that doesn't have a 24/7 camera around them. You can't get away with anything today because of these technologies. So millennials aren't there. And then the hardworking bit. They say that they're not hardworking. I don't buy it, and here's why. They say that it takes a millennial, on average, 7 minutes to post a picture to Instagram. Now, doesn't seem like a lot, but let's think about this. We got to take a picture, and then we got to look at the picture. And then we need to retake the picture because the angle wasn't right? And then after we get the picture and get the right one, then we have to put the right filter on the picture because Instagram gives you all these filters that make your eyes pop and all these little smiley faces and stuff that you can put on. I got to get the right one. Then after I have that, I also have to get the right description. What am I describing of what's going on here? And then after that, I got to put the right hashtag on it so it has proper legs so that people all around the world can search my hashtag on there and see that it's on there. You tell me that doesn't take hard work, dedication, and perseverance. I don't know what does. So millennials are hardworking, dedicated, and persevering type of people. No, in all seriousness, the millennial generation does have a little bit more challenging of a time, and here's why. Their entire lives have been filtered through technology. Because even though we can have access to everything, we also can filter anything we want to. And most people, if we're being honest, filter life on social media. We put the best things out there. We don't put the worst. We put the right filters that make the sunset look just perfect and all of these other things. And millennials are more susceptible to that because they've had it almost their entire lives. I mean, you can do things like wear shirts that make you look hip and young and cool, and then you realize that you're not hip and young and cool anymore, right? And millennials are in this generation where we can make ourselves look way better than we are. And see, because of that, they're way more susceptible to be inauthentic in their everyday lives. And this is what we've been talking about. Last week we talked about contentment. We're in a Like Me series. We talked about contentment and how a lack of contentment leads us to not fully embracing who we are and how we've been accepted by Jesus. This week we're talking about authenticity. And we're going to look at how acceptance really plays itself out in an authentic life that we're transparent and real, and how being inauthentic keeps us from being accepted by who Jesus has made us to be, how we were created in his image, and any inauthentic life takes away from the fact that we were made in God's image. Ultimately, if you walk out of anything here today, I want you to remember this. To be truly accepted by Jesus and to be authentic, you've got to remove the mask. You have to remove the mask in your lives. I know, a little bit of a creepy picture, but hey, masks are creepy, right? So if you have a problem with clowns or anything like that, I'm sorry. We'll get through it as quickly as we can today. But I want you to understand that you've got to be able to remove the mask to be truly authentic and to be truly accepted by who Jesus created us to be originally. I think one of the greatest passages seen in all of the Bible about an inauthentic life is seen through 2 Corinthians 3, verses 12 through 16. That's found on page 1024 of the Black Bibles scattered throughout the room. As always, if you do not own a Bible, that Bible is yours to take. I find no more greater joy than to see people walking away with the Bibles that we have in the room. So if you don't own a Bible, take that Bible. It's yours to keep. We're going to be on page 1024 today. And by the way, if you're a notes-taking person and you're looking for those notes, we try to save a couple of trees. We put them online. You can go to journeypoint.org. You can swipe left a couple of times, and you can find our message notes. And today's message notes are there. And then you can literally email them to yourself right when you're done so that you have those in your inbox and can go back and check those at any point. Before we dive in here, before we dive into 2 Corinthians 3 today, there has to be a little setting up to what's going on here. So those new to the Bible or kind of still processing their thoughts about Christianity, Corinthians was written by a guy named the Apostle Paul. Like lots of followers, social media guru, people would follow him in droves everywhere he went, right? The Apostle Paul was. Big time deal back then. He wrote these letters to the church in Corinth. And as you can see on the screen, it's part of 13 letters that he actually wrote to the church. The one we're in today is his second letter we wrote, But if you read the first and second one, you find out in there that he actually wrote a third one at some point. We don't know where it is or anything like that, but it talks about the lost letter. And so you would find out that he actually wrote 3 letters to the church in Corinth. And so Paul wrote letters to encourage the church, to equip the church, and really to keep them updated with what was going on in his life. So this is the second one that's recorded in the Bible. Now, in the passage today, Paul mentions something that may be new to some of us. He talks about Moses, and he talks about the Old Covenant. And the very mention of an Old Covenant means that there's probably something that's new, right? You heard it in one of the songs that Zach talked about, the Old and the New. So he talks about the Old Covenant, and so I'd love to just break that down a little bit. Very briefly, Moses, who he talks about here. Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. And actually, the entire Old Testament kind of focuses on these 5 books of the Bible in the Old Covenant and the Old Testament. And it was the emphasis in the beginning. This is well before Jesus' time, right? So you have this kind of old versus new type mentality. See, this was a time where God's people obeyed him, and in return for their obedience, God would bless and protect them. So it was really kind of a works-based type of mentality and a works-based relationship with God at that point. But then in terms of forgiveness of sins, so in terms of how they were forgiven of sins back then for living outside of God's desire for them, the Old Covenant required a literal sacrifice. I mean, like an actual sacrifice. Many times that was animals, and they would light incense in the temples and things like that. It required a sacrifice daily. I don't know about you, but I'm so messed up, I would have had to have a trailer of things to sacrifice for that. It's just like, man, I got to go again, right? And so this was that Old Covenant type of mentality. The priest, the high priest, and the officials back then, they were the only ones that had access to God. It wasn't a personal relationship with Jesus like we have now, but it was very much, there were extreme regulations and laws and things to have that played out. Now the New Covenant was brought in by Jesus. Right? So the New Covenant is brought in with Jesus. These regulations ended with his life, his death, his burial, and then his resurrection. Right? So the regulations that were in the Old Covenant were wiped away with the New. And so God showed his love for people then by bringing this greater love through Jesus. And through a faith in him, not sacrificing, we were forgiven of our sins. And it's by asking, not by the works that we do. So it's kind of it's finished mentality through Jesus. And so the New Covenant brought a hope like never before. It was very new to the people back in this time, at the time of the writing. And so that's what Paul dives into here in the 2 Corinthians passage. Now, one thing to remember, the Old Covenant, just because it was the Old Covenant, doesn't mean it's washed away and we don't care about it anymore. We turn our noses up to it and say, oh, that's just old stuff. No, it was what was used by God in the beginning as his plan to set up the greater love for Jesus that was coming and that we saw through him. And it's something that was great, but the New Covenant was better. Old Covenant wasn't bad, it's just the New Covenant was better. And even more importantly, it was everlasting and unchanging, the New Covenant was. So basically, if you've ever had to walk someone through new technology, think about that, right? It's not that you're knocking the old technology, you're just walking someone through. And if you're that person that's been walked through new technology, you're probably thankful for it, right? If you don't use social media, just be thankful for that, but someone would have to walk you through it, right? He's not knocking the old technology here. Moses, this old technology. Paul's not knocking it. He's just saying, hey, there's something a little bit better, right? The iPhone X is a little bit better than the iPhone 4. Just trust me, is what Paul is saying. Right? And so for you Samsung kind of Google people, just believe me, the new battery won't catch your house on fire. I mean, that's what Paul is saying in this deal, right? So trust me. So 2 Corinthians chapter 3, we're going to be in 12 through 16. Let me pray, and then we will get after it. That, again, is on page 1024. Lord, we love you. I thank you that you brought the new. I thank you for Jesus. And I thank you that there are not these regulations and these things that we have to keep up with like we saw in the Old Covenant. Lord, I thank you that Jesus brings the new and that a faith in him brings a life that we've never lived or never experienced before. God, I pray that you would come alive in the word that we were reading this morning out of your Bible. God, use it for your honor and your glory. It's in your name we pray. Amen. All right, so 2 Corinthians 3, let's look at verse 12. Here's what he says. He says, since then we have such a hope, we act with great boldness. We act with great boldness. So see, Paul here, you have to remember, is talking to a bunch of people that are not used to this new covenant principle. They were raised, their ancestors were raised, everything around them was this old covenant mentality, but this new covenant is something that was new, but it was infusing new life everywhere around them. And so he's trying to walk them into this new time and this new covenant. It's very, very new to them. It's like you using the new iPad or the new phone for the first time. You're just trying to figure it out. It's awesome, but you're trying to figure out how you can get to your old messages, right? Is basically what Paul is doing. And in this newness, there's a new boldness now, because they were able to actually have and be a relationship with God and be who God originally created them to be. You see, they were able to live in a way that really wasn't available to them prior to this. And they're experiencing this kind of new religion and this religious background for the first time. And it's really life-giving for them. There's no more regulations, laws, and rules that they have to abide by, but they place their faith in Jesus. And so they're already operating with a new boldness. And that's what Paul's saying. Let me ask you this. Have you ever noticed that the more comfortable we get in situations, the more bold we become? Maybe it's in your work or in your family or in just relationships. The more comfortable you become, the more authentic you are in it, the more bold you end up becoming in it. That's what Paul is saying here. We act with a great boldness. You know, I think this boldness not only plays out in our jobs and in our careers and in our family, but honestly, just any relationship. You know, maybe when you first met your spouse or a friend, you may have walked up to them and you maybe did things really right, kind of prim and proper. You were going to, tuck your shirt in or whatever it is that you thought they would like. But then as the relationship continued going, you got more and more relaxed and more comfortable, right? You didn't have to do the right things anymore that you thought they would like. You became more bold. You became more authentic. And the more authentic you became, the more bold you became. Libby and I, this week, we were having lunch. And we were having lunch with a friend that we've only known for about eight months, somewhere around there. And we have clearly crossed into the comfort zone. And it's awesome. And let me tell you how I know. In the middle of this conversation, this girl says, hang on, hold on. Stands up and kind of leans over. And you guessed it, she actually rips one right in front of us. I kid you not, like this happened. I'm not making this up. Rips one right in front of us. And I just saw, #awkward, like, whoa, what we got going on here? But later on, Libby and I were talking about it. We were pumped because it meant that we had crossed into a new relationship zone with this person. Because when we're authentic, we're real. You see, no one will do anything like that unless the mask has been removed, right? When the mask is removed, then we can act in a bold way. That's when we act how comfortable we are. That's when we act how we really are, because authenticity brings boldness. Authenticity always brings boldness. You see, when we're not bold, the exact opposite happens. We begin to harden people's hearts and harden the situations that are around us. And that's exactly what Paul is alluding to here in the next verse. Pick up in verse 13 with me. He says, we are not like Moses, who used to put a veil over his face to prevent the Israelites from gazing steadily until the end of the glory of what was being set aside. Now, a little bit of a backstory here. In Exodus 34, this is actually the reference that Paul is making here in verses 13. In Exodus 34, Moses was leading God's people. And as he's leading God's people, he actually got to talk directly with God. Moses got to talk directly with God. And when he did, his face glowed. Now, I don't know about you, but like if I had a direct access to God, I'd let everybody know it. Like, hey, I'm the guy that's got the direct access to God. Come talk to me. So maybe that's what Moses was doing. No, because he veiled his face. And we have to look at it and go, well, why did he veil his face? Maybe it's because no one wants to talk to somebody with a glowing face. I don't know. No, that's not it either. It's actually veiled because Moses didn't want them to see the glory fading. You see, because his face was glowing after he talked with God, saying that he had been in the presence of God. And then as the glory faded from Moses, his face stopped glowing. And so here's the deal. There is no leader that wants their people to know that the glory is gone. And so Moses said, instead of letting them know I've been talking to God, I'm going to veil my face so they don't see it glowing, so that they can't see the glory leave me. Because if they see it leave me, maybe they won't trust me. Maybe they won't be bought in. Maybe they won't walk in the way that I want them to walk because they don't think I'm a competent leader because the glory is gone. They might think I'm washed up. You see, this is why we don't let people know about our failures. Because we don't want them to know that we're not perfect. We don't have things going on like we want them to be. You see, maybe we do things like post pictures like some of these. We'll post a picture like this of our house and we'll throw something out there like, oh man, the house is a wreck, need to clean it. It's like, right? You know that person. And it's like, okay, the one toy sitting on the deal, that's not a wreck. Let me show you a wreck, right? And so maybe we do that, right? We put this false image about who we really are. They paid somebody big time money to make their house look like that, right? And so maybe, just maybe, we should do things, what I'm trying to do here, I call it Trainwreck Tuesday. So I need to go back to doing it. I'm starting to take pictures of Trainwreck Tuesdays. They look more like this. This is like what my house would look like, right? And so why don't we post these things? It's because we don't want people to think less of us. So we veil it. We mask it. We become inauthentic. We post the best vacations, the house cleaned up. We post a picture of our kids all looking at the camera, not the 50 that we took before that where none of them are looking at the camera, right? And so that's what happens. And so according to Moses, when I post things like this, they may think differently of me. They may think that I don't have it all together, or our kids do mess up, or they, as well as Libby and I, have meltdowns at times, right? But posting just the good is veiling like Moses did, or masking, or being inauthentic. It covers up the bad, and it keeps people from thinking less of us and less of our role as maybe a parent or a worker or a pastor or a leader, right? And honestly, this isn't even just with friends. How about just not even with social media either? How about just in our relationships with our kids? The other day, our middle son, Paxton, he's emotional. He's an emotional, kind of dramatic kid. And so he kind of is like rage monstering, like just loud and mad and like, just going off. And I get louder and I get more mad as he gets more mad, right? And so in the middle of him getting mad, I had to apologize to him. I had to say, hey, Paxton, as I'm going, hey, why are you rage monstering? As I'm rage monstering. And I'm doing that. And I had the choice at that moment to either apologize to him because I didn't set the good example, or I could have veiled it. I could have masked it. I could have let him know that his dad doesn't mess up and that he's the one in the wrong. I chose to be authentic. I chose to be real. I chose to be honest with him. And so sometimes this veiling of our lives is just even with our own kids and letting them know that, you know what? Dad's not perfect. I don't have it all together, bud. I'm trying to figure this out just as you are. Because here's what's happening when we don't remove the mask. We harden ourselves and those around us. This is what Paul says. He says in verse 14, but their minds were hardened. For to this day, at the reading of the old covenant, the same veil remains. It is not lifted because it is set aside only in Christ. Yet still today, whenever Moses is read, a veil lies over their hearts. You see, because of Moses' his lack of authenticity here, God's people and their minds were hardened to the purposes of the fading glory. And not only did it affect that generation then, but it affected, as Paul said, to this day. And so what happens is you have traditional Orthodox Jewish people that still have yet to claim Jesus as the Messiah, as the Bible proclaimed, because they do not place their faith that he was the actual Messiah. Their faces were veiled to him being that. And their hearts were hardened, as Paul says. You see, God faded the shining glory on Moses' face for a reason. It was so people could see that the old covenant was just temporary, that something greater was coming, that this was not an everlasting, unchanging covenant, that something greater would be taking its place in Jesus. You see, the old was a preparation for the new. So by masking himself and putting a veil over his face, Moses prevented them from understanding the truth and the purpose behind the fading glory. And I think the same is true in our lives. Because never forget this. Being who you aren't keeps you from becoming who you are. Being who you aren't on social media, in your job, in your relationships with your family, keeps you from becoming who you are. See, because when you're inauthentic with your life, when you walk around wearing a mask time and time again, you now believe in this mask. You've got to put it on. I've got to do something more. It fuels you. I've got to keep up with what's going on with this mask that I'm putting on. And I have to think of how to hide the other aspects that don't line up with the mask that I'm putting on for people to see. Ultimately, it keeps us from being who we are, and it makes us as inauthentic as we can possibly be. Social media fuels that, but it's also in our lives everywhere around us. You see, because when you aren't really who you are, you're not bold. It doesn't take a whole lot to cover up and do these things. You're bold when you're who you are. I mean, if you stand up in the middle of a conversation and just let one go, that's bold. Being bold is not, pretending it didn't happen. And so, also, I don't know if there's any Avengers people here, but in game, no spoilers, I promise I'm not giving it away here, but my favorite part of the movie is when the Hulk just embraces who he is. He's wearing skinny jeans and cardigan sweaters, and he's taking selfies with kids as the Hulk. That's my favorite part of the movie. I'm like, that's bold, man. It's a bold move to be a big dude like that wearing skinny jeans, and it's a bold move, right? But he's who he is. You see, and I think for you and I, in order for us to be as bold as we possibly can, the only way we can do it is knowing who we are in Jesus. That's the only way we can be bold. And this is what Paul points to in verse 16. Here's what he says. But whenever a person turns to the Lord, the veil is removed. The mask is gone. You're authentic when we turn to Jesus. You see, the only way to remove the mask, according to this passage, and honestly lines up with the rest of the Bible, is to place our faith in Jesus. And then and only then, when we remove that mask, does it remove the desire to keep up with the world. Because what happens is when we place our faith in Jesus and we remove the mask and do those things, we're no longer worried about what the world thinks of us. See, when we find our acceptance in Jesus and who he is and who he designed and made us to be, it is so much easier to rest in who that person is. So much easier to rest in our true self. However lame that may be to other people, however unexciting that may be to other people, however boring that may be to other people, it's just who we are. We were having a conversation in our Connect group this week, which, by the way, Connect groups are the best way for you to connect with those on your same journey. It's the best way for you to connect with those in the church. I tell a lot of people that if you give us 1 hour during the week, Connect group is where I would like you to give it, because you're going to connect with other people and you're going to be real authentic and real with them. And so I would highly advise you to contact Seth and get involved in some of our Connect groups. We'll have some new ones starting up in just a couple of weeks this summer. But we're in there, and one of the things that came up is hey, tomorrow we got to go to work. And someone is going to ask you, how was your weekend? And at that moment, this person in our Connect group, she said, man, sometimes that's just hard, right? Because we have to go, did what I do this weekend live up to their expectations for me? It was a big weekend at the Home Depot really that exciting? Did sitting around in my pajamas and eating food and ice cream while I should have been working, was that really that exciting, right? And so we have this choice. We either we get all flustered and we have to come up with something that's going to mask our identity and make us seem cool and relevant and all this other kind of stuff, or we're just hey, you know what? I had about 1,000 things I needed to do. I didn't get any of it done. It was awesome. I loved every minute of that, right? And so we have this opportunity to either be real and authentic or just mask and continue to have lack of transparency and a lack of realness in our life to others. So you'll have that tomorrow. So I know that you'll be thinking about that. So what's the deal? How do we remove the mask, Chris? How can we do this? Practically, what can we do? I think there's 5 ways. First one is this: increase your self-awareness. You have to increase your self-awareness. When we understand ourselves better, we are able to then properly understand that we were uniquely created, that we're unique individuals. And you can only do that the better you understand yourself. Some of the things that we do today after service, actually, and if you want to be a part of this, we would love to have you. We have something called Starting Point, which goes into who Journey Point is and what we are. But then in several weeks, we're going to have our first Launching Point is what we call it, where we dive into personality characteristics, leadership abilities, our leadership development process, and spiritual gifts and all of those things. And so that's creating self-awareness of who we are and how we can live out who God has designed us to be. You have to increase your self-awareness. The second thing is this: you have to own your imperfections. You have to own your imperfections. Don't look to your imperfections as a failure at all. It's who you are. It's who you're created to be. What you do with your imperfections is you start to surround people around you that help you with your imperfections. Look at any team or organization. You would want the leader, the key leader, the top dog. You would want that person to not mask their imperfections, but you would want them to surround themselves with people that build up the whole team, right? We need to own our imperfections. We have to own them, that we are weak and frail in areas. And so how do we overcome that? Third thing is this: embrace vulnerability. Embrace vulnerability. One of my favorite quotes is by a guy named Craig Rochelle. He says this: you may impress people with your strengths, but you will only connect with people in your weaknesses. You can impress people with your strengths all day long, but if you're truly looking to connect with people, you're only going to connect with them in your weaknesses. Never forget that. You have to embrace vulnerability. The next thing, 4, don't filter. Simply don't filter your life. Post the good and the bad. Post the kids looking at the picture and the meltdowns. I would love for you to post the meltdowns because that's fun for me to watch other kids melt down too. It makes me feel better about myself. But like Trainwreck Tuesday, right? Join me this Tuesday. I'm going to find something that just goes, oh, snap, like that's really messed up. I'm glad that's not me, right? And so again, that's because people connect with you on your weaknesses, but don't filter. Now, don't hear what I'm not saying. Everything, just because it's a train wreck, doesn't mean I need to embrace it as a train wreck. There are some things that don't need to be a train wreck, okay? Like, it doesn't just give us this okay to go like, that's all right, I'll just live in this, right? There are some things that we need to overcome. But post the real life. Post the good and the bad, the highs and the lows, to let people know who you really are. And I think that goes into the last one, number 5, honor authenticity. Just honor authenticity. Do it in your work, do it with your family, do it with your friends that are being real and transparent and honest with you. Honor authenticity. Let your life honor that. Let your marriage honor that. Let your relationships honor that. Let your job honor authenticity in everything that you do. Honor authenticity. You see, in order to remove the mask in our lives, in order to just break it away, remove the mask, be who we are, I don't think there's a better way to do it than just to understand that God accepts you for who you are. God actually made you for who you are. He created you specifically, gave you personality, gave you all of these other giftings so that you could be who you are, not someone you're not. And so maybe that's all of us. That's what we just need to hear. We need to hear that God made us how we are and to be who we are. He created us just the way we are. He likes us, right? I mean, like, if he liked us on social media, it would be there. He would like every post. He would do that. He would be a follower of ours. If he was engaged with it, he would share our posts to others. I think he would share the Trainwreck Tuesday posts probably more than the filtered ones, right? Because those are real. I mean, think about it. Jesus ran after disciples that honestly were failures. They failed things like rabbinical school. That's why they had jobs and careers and where they did. And so Jesus ran after them because they were being who they were, how they were created to be. And look, 2019, more than 2,000 years later, we have this message because they were being who God made them to be. See, removing the mask doesn't happen when I'm not who God made me to be. It just doesn't happen. Because being who we aren't keeps us from becoming who we are, always. You know, and for some of us, maybe we just need to remember that today. There's some in the room that just need to remember that, you know, God made me this way. I know it. I've placed my faith in him. I remembered the time that I placed my faith in him, and I remembered that he made me how he made me to be, that I was made in his image, and man, I need to get back on track. Some of us, maybe that's it. Just embracing that and being real so that we can finally stop worrying about all the filters that we've placed on our life. So for some of us, that's there. And then honestly, for some of us, maybe for the first time, we just need to accept who God made us to be. We need to accept his death, his burial, and his resurrection. We need to accept the fact that he died for me. We need to accept the fact that my life should be lived for him, with him right at the center of it, leading it. If that's you, I would love for all of us as we go into this time of response, whether you need to remember or whether today is the very first time, let's just go into a time of response before Zach sings for us and just pray and thank God for making us how we've been created. Jesus, I love looking out in a room and seeing people, individuals, how you created them. They have different strengths that I will never possess. They have different giftings that I will never have, and I'm so grateful for that. Lord, I pray that you would help us remember that you created us in your image and in a way that you desire to, so that you could use us, Lord. And I know for some, there are some today that are out here that have never placed their faith in you. And if that were me, I would want to pray something like this. Jesus, thank you. Thank you for dying for me. Thank you for making me in your image. Thank you for creating me just the way I am. However boring or non-exciting that may be for others, thank you. Jesus, today I say yes to you. I say yes, and I give my life to you to lead. Amen.